is really taking us kind of into the practical realm and talking about institutional responses to the current state of protest in South Africa. And what we're going to do is I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the context to which this project is responding to, and then outline what the project is about. R2P stands for the right to protest, and then Mbali will talk to you a little bit about the kind of some of the initial emerging themes that are confronting the project already, and then throw out some questions that we're hoping you're going to guide us on. In the interest of time, I'm not going to spend much time establishing protest as a feature of the South African landscape. I think for the present moment, if we can just all accept that it is a constant and interesting feature of our landscape today. I think what's, in our paper we talk in more detail about things like frequency of protest and cause of protest. Both of those are contested ideas. There is fascinating statistics out there which vary widely in terms of how prevalent protest actually is, I think largely due to what is classified as protest and what isn't. And there is also a very interesting emerging literature about the causes of protest. For a long time in South Africa, we were a little bit obsessed with this phrase of service delivery protest, which became a kind of catch-all for all kinds of protest motivated by a much more nuanced array of kind of causes and drivers than service delivery. But for the purposes of today, just to flag that one of the things that is critical about understanding protest in South Africa is that protest is not just a strategy of revolution, but it is also a constitutionally protected right. That is the text of our right there. Everyone has the right peacefully and unarmed to assemble, demonstrate, picket, and present petitions. So what's interesting to just pause and acknowledge there is that there's very few limitations to that right. The peacefully and unarmed part, I think, are the biggest limitations, which is why violence becomes, and understanding what constitutes violence and who is in fact perpetrating violence becomes such an important part of these debates. We also have a piece of legislation, the Regulation of Gatherings Act, which is designed ostensibly to give effect to that right. Protest is also importantly understood in South Africa as an enabling right, in the sense that it is important both in and of itself, but also because it gives voice and gives life and gives realization to other rights in the Bill of Rights. Protest is an incredibly traumatic process in South Africa that people resort to almost always as a last resort, and always because there is some other end that they are trying to achieve. In contrast to that theory, the standard South African story about wonderful progressive protection in theory, the practice is something very different. We see at the moment a closing space for protest in South Africa, increasing risks of arrest, criminalization of protesters, very heavy-handed response to protest by police, local authorities, a whole range of actors. And importantly to acknowledge that protest is an equality issue. Although there is a rise of white middle-class protest in South Africa, those are not the protesters who are being criminalized. That it is largely black communities who are the subject of this clampdown and this criminalization of protest. So turning to the institutional part of the picture, which is that what happened in South Africa is post our transition to democracy, during the 70s and 80s and early 90s, criminal work and protection of protesters was the bread and butter of a human rights lawyer in South Africa. It's what our predecessors were doing as an everyday part of their work. But then along comes democracy, and we have this great constitution, the right to protest, tick, hooray, and that kind of work dies down, that expertise dies down. There's a kind of sense that although there's some early work on civil and political rights, we quite quickly transition into focusing on socioeconomic rights, because we think that the civil and political rights work is done, and it's safe now, we can move on to the harder work of socioeconomic rights. And what we've seen in the last 5 years is really a kind of very urgent need to move back into the civil and political terrain and start re-understanding the connection between those different kinds of rights. And what has been interesting then is to watch the moves of the human rights legal community in that. Because all of a sudden we're in a space where our community partners are increasingly asking us for assistance on things like bail. 2-3 years ago, your average human rights lawyer in South Africa had never done a bail application, didn't know where to start. And that led to increasing waves of frustration and ultimately anger from our community partners who would be protesting, would get arrested and then would go knocking on doors. And almost without exception, the NGOs that they were speaking to were like, well, we don't do that kind of work. Driven largely by funding streams towards strategic litigation. No one was doing the less sexy, everyday direct legal services criminal law work. And that is really the kind of genesis for the birth of this project, that it was no longer possible for us not to be responding to that. And that's led to a return to protest work, to criminal work amongst human rights lawyers. I think both waves of Fees Must Fall have been an enormously important catalyst in that, in getting us to kind of reskill in that area and to start kind of collaborating and working together in that area. And that's really where we see the Right to Protest project coming from. This is a coalition project. It's a whole bunch of civil society actors coming together to try and provide a platform for coordinated support for protest, the kind of defense work of holding back the walls and keeping the space open. We can talk a lot more later or in Q&A about the structure of the project, but just to flag that we are very interested in expanding. So if this is something that resonates with you, we really are looking to expand our membership to more organizations, more members, so please do come and chat to us about that. Very quickly, the objectives that we're trying to achieve is the realization of our right to protest, where protest is something that becomes possible without the risk of criminalization in South Africa, coupled with a desire to shift the narrative of protest, of this kind of narrative of violent black mobs protesting, and to really tackle that head on and shift that kind of discourse. So with that, I apologize and we'll hand over to you.
Okay, before I start, I want to emphasize that the project has been staffed and in existence as a staffed entity for about 2 months. So everything, these emerging themes have basically been themes that have come out in the last 2 months. So what does the collaboration that R2P emphasizes and sees as an essential tool for the work that it does, what does that collaboration look like? And I think it was very important to integrate collaboration as a strategic approach for the project. So the project takes very seriously geographic location, and we're very aware that a lot of the organizations that are part of R2P are in the urban centers. So there's a necessity to kind of think about how to assist communities that aren't in these urban centers, and to ensure that our work has kind of thought about reach in very complex ways. So in order to do that, we had to really think about network building and using a referral system that reaches those places. And thus far, we've used legal aid in places where the organizations don't reach, and I think in future the project will grow and it will reach places that the organizations that are in the coalition aren't in those areas, so it will reach those areas. And then there's also the necessity to have an interdisciplinary approach, because a lot of the requests that we receive are not for legal assistance. People know that they want or that they need help, but sometimes they're unsure what type of help they need. So the assistance that we provide deals with all the complexities involved in protest, around protest. So we get requests coming in our hotline from people who need who need assistance based on a particular lens. So the project, there's a necessity to have an interdisciplinary approach for the project because of the different requests that come in. And then I think also there's the need to take seriously how certain protests are given more importance and are given more value than others. So, for example, your fees must fall is given that media attention, people are willing to assist, people know what's happening on campuses, but your mining communities don't get that much support. So the project takes very seriously those power dynamics and the need to ensure that equal value is given to protesters because they're all agents of change. So equal value must be given to the different changes they want to implement. Another emerging issue is the use of the law as a weapon. And often the law is used as a way to stifle protest, to ensure protest is contained and controlled. And the way in which this has been happening is through the use or the abuse of interdicts, the abuse of bail procedures, and heavy-handed police responses. So I think our observations about the abuse of interdicts come from the abuse of interdicts by mines and huge private sector corporations, but also the universities. And an observation that's come from all the interdicts that we've analyzed is that it isn't clear who these interdicts are interdicting. So there's been a bad use of law, and interdicts are interdicting vague people, hashtags, and so you're unsure where who is being prohibited and where the prohibition ends and where it starts. And another emerging theme is the abuse of bail procedures, and we've had cases where people have said, ever since you've been in court, the protests have stopped. So we're going to keep you in custody and to ensure that protest is stifled. So that's been kind of what has happened across the country over the last 2 months. And it's important that such bad use of or abuse of bail procedures is highlighted and addressed by progressive lawyering. The use of heavy-handed police responses, I think, is something that has been highlighted in media, and how there's been an over-securitization and militarization of protest spaces. And there's this assumption that violence is inherent within protests. So you see that disproportionate response is kind of working off the assumption that a criminal act is going to take place in a protest. And then we have just a few questions that we'd like to hear what you have to say about these questions that we're thinking about. And I think because it's a new project, we need your insights. So what does R2P need to acknowledge about the context to which it is responding to? And are coalitions the way forward? Are there a strategic model to address issues of law in society, such as how the right to protest is handled at the moment? And how can R2P transform public perception on protest? And what are the things we are doing based on on the emerging issues that I've spoken about? What are we doing right? What are we not doing? Where are our blind spots? And another one is, how do we navigate violence? And I think Jamila spoke about this. Violence it's complex. It's not the violence you hear about in the newspapers. And I think that we need to navigate violence or understand violence in complex ways. So how do we adequately address violence and navigate it within the law profession and outside the law profession? So also, since the law has been claimed by conservative forces, how do we claim back the law? And what is the role of lawyers in protests? And just to wrap up, I'm going to wrap up with a call to think about the questions that we've posed, and to firstly, if you're interested in joining the Right to Protest project, it is a coalition project, but also we'd like to hear some of your insights on some of the questions that we've posed. Thanks.